As early as the 9th century BCE, inscriptions from Assyrian kings describe extreme violence as if it were a source of pride. King Ashurnasirpal II, one of the earliest and most feared monarchs, wrote that after capturing rebellious cities, he flayed the leaders and impaled their men on stakes. The cruelty was public. The empire's capital cities Ashur, Kalhu, and later Nineveh became centers of power and propaganda. That time impalement stood out as the ultimate symbol of Assyrian dominance. The process began after a city was conquered or a rebellion crushed. Prisoners were gathered and separated by rank. The ordinary soldiers might be enslaved or executed swiftly, but the leaders, the ones who had defied the king, were chosen for something far worse. These men were to become examples, displayed where everyone could see what defiance truly cost. Assyrian executioners prepared long, sturdy stakes usually made of sharpened wood or, in some cases, reinforced with metal tips. The poles were driven deep into the ground so they could stand upright for days, even weeks. The height and thickness of each stake were chosen carefully, depending on how long the punishment was meant to last. Once the stakes were ready, the condemned were brought forward. They were stripped, bound, and forced to face their punishment in front of soldiers and civilians alike. The act was methodical. The victim's body was positioned above the stake, sometimes through the abdomen, sometimes through the chest, and in rare cases through the ribs or backside. The goal was not instant death, but slow agony. The weight of the body would gradually pull the victim downward, making the stake pierce deeper as hours passed. Unlike later forms of execution, Assyrian impalement was not performed in secrecy. It was a public display meant to terrify. Stakes lined the entrances of cities, castle walls, and main roads. Merchants, travelers, and enemy scouts passing by would see the bodies raised above the ground, their fate serving as a silent warning to everyone who entered the empire's domain. Even in their official records, the Assyrian kings did not hide what they had done. They boasted of it. Inscriptions from Ashurnasirpal II describe him impaling hundreds of rebels at once, while later kings like Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal continued the tradition. To them, the stakes were not just instruments of death, they were symbols of imperial power, proof that Assyria ruled through absolute fear. The display was as important as the execution itself. The corpses were left untouched, sometimes for days, until birds and insects began to claim them. The sight and stench of decaying bodies became part of Assyria's psychological warfare. By the time word of such punishment spread, most rebellious cities had already chosen surrender over resistance. In Assyrian eyes, impalement worked. It silenced uprisings, discouraged conspiracies, and reminded conquered peoples that no one, not even a king, could defy the will of the Assyrian ruler and live. The method's horror was its effectiveness, and that was exactly how the empire intended it. Another known example comes from the reign of Sennacherib in the 7th century BCE, during his campaign against rebellious cities in the Levant. While most of his inscriptions boast of siege victories, one mentions impaling rebel leaders near the walls of their captured towns. The people who once ruled those lands were forced to watch their kings and generals displayed like warnings before being enslaved themselves. Even Ashurbanipal, remembered as the last great king of Assyria, continued this tradition. His records mention the impalement of captured leaders from Elam and Arabia after their failed uprisings. Reliefs carved in his palace show rows of prisoners executed or displayed on stakes while others are marched away in chains. It was not just a method of death, it was part of the empire's art, propaganda carved in stone. These punishments weren't limited to men. Some records mention the execution of royal families and officials' wives when cities revolted. Women and children were not always spared, sometimes enslaved, sometimes killed, but always used to remind the world that Assyria tolerated no resistance. The practice of impalement reached its height during the Neo-Assyrian Empire, a period that stretched roughly from 911 to 609 BCE. This was the age when Assyria stood as the most feared power in the ancient world, and its kings ruled not only through armies but through terror carved into the memory of nations. A century later, during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, 745 to 727 BCE, Assyria expanded far beyond its original borders. With more conquests came more rebellions, and with each rebellion came another wave of impalements. His campaigns across Syria and Israel left behind long trails of punishment. By this point, impalement was no longer just a punishment, it was policy. Every new province learned quickly that defiance would bring death in the most public way imaginable. Under Sennacherib, 705 to 681 BCE, the empire reached even greater power, and so did its cruelty. His wars against Babylon and Judah are infamous, not only for destruction but for the punishments that followed. Historical reliefs from this era show defeated soldiers executed, cities burned, and impaled bodies surrounding the walls of conquered lands. Each victory celebration was also a display of pain meant to silence the next rebellion before it began. These acts took place across the empire's vast territory from Nineveh, the glittering capital on the Tigris River, to Nimrud, Ashur, and the many provincial cities that lay under Assyrian control. Even conquered lands far to the west, like Lachish in present-day Israel, bore witness to the same horror. The pattern never changed. Wherever the Assyrian army marched, impaled bodies followed. For nearly 3 centuries, this system of terror worked. Cities surrendered before sieges began, and enemies at the sight of Assyria's banners. Fear maintained what armies could not. But it also created deep hatred. The neighboring nations that once trembled began to unite against their oppressors. And when they finally rose together, Assyria's cruelty could no longer protect it. The Assyrian Empire didn't just conquer cities, it transformed them into warnings. Wherever its armies marched, they left behind a trail of destruction so severe that ancient writers later called their capitals the cities of skulls. The name wasn't poetic exaggeration, it described what was truly seen. After every major siege, the aftermath followed a brutal routine. The defeated city was stripped of its wealth, its walls torn down, and its leaders executed. The remains of the dead were gathered and used as monuments of victory. Piles of skulls stood beside the gates, while rows of impaled bodies lined the main roads leading in and out of the city. These displays were not temporary. They stayed for days, sometimes weeks, until decay made them part of the earth itself. For Assyria, this was a language everyone understood. The gruesome displays spoke louder than any treaty. They told neighboring states exactly what awaited those who dared to rebel. Assyrian kings even recorded these punishments in official reliefs carved inside their palaces. Visitors to Nineveh or Nimrud would walk through halls where walls were covered with images of siege, slaughter, and impalement. The empire celebrated fear as an achievement. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Stone reliefs from Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh show defeated soldiers being impaled outside their captured cities. The same scenes appear again under Ashurbanipal, proving that these horrors were not isolated acts but a consistent imperial policy.